Hello and a warm welcome to you all. I'm Heather from RedDoor Press, proud publisher of Alison Booth. I'm delighted you can join us today and celebrate the publication day of Alison's latest novel, The Painting. Here it is in its full glory. Before we get started, I have a little bit of Zoom housekeeping to do. As I'm sure you're aware, Zoom can be a little bit temperamental, so we've muted you all for now just to stop the videos bouncing. I'm delighted that we have a wonderful Q&A planned with Alison in conversation with Professor and author Ann McGrath. So the best way to view today's event is to watch it in speaker view. This way you can see all the speakers at the same time. So if you're in speaker view, click on the three dots on your right hand side of your tile, hide non-video participants, and you'll see all the speakers at the same time. So whilst Anne will be asking lots of questions, there'll be an opportunity for your questions from the floor. So please do type them into the chat function. You should see it if you click on the chat function in the middle, and I will read them out later. We'll also post details on the chat of where you can buy a copy of the book wherever you are in the world. And it goes out saying that The Painting and Alison's other novels are available online from all good online retailers. So on to the launch. Alison Booth is the author of 6 novels and has contributed short stories to a number of collections. Her debut novel, Stillwater Creek, was highly commended in the 2011 ACT Book of the Year Award, and A Perfect Marriage was highly commended in 2019 ACT Writing and Publishing Awards. Alison was Professor of Economics at the University of Essex until 2013 and is now Emeritus Professor at the Australian National University. I'm delighted to have all of you with us today and would love to share a brief synopsis of the book to get us started. When Annika Molnar flees her home country of Hungary, not long before the breakup of the Soviet Union, she carries only a small suitcase and a beautiful and much-loved painting of an auburn-haired woman in a cobalt blue dress from her family's hidden collection. Arriving in Australia, Annika moves in with her aunt in Sydney, and the painting hangs in pride of place in her bedroom. But one day it is stolen, and Annika's carefree life takes a more ominous turn. Sinister secrets from her family's past and Hungary's fraught history cast suspicion over the painting's provenance, and she embarks on a gripping quest to uncover the truth. Hungary's war-torn past contrasts sharply with Australia's bright new world of opportunity in this moving and compelling mystery. Now, I, for one, am fascinated with where the idea for the novel came from, and I can't wait for Alison to tell us more about that. When I read the book, I found myself drawn to the sinister overtones from Annika's past, the fraught history of her home country, and her quest for truth. Will she find her painting? Suffice to say, I think you'll love it. So now it's time to introduce Alison. Hi Alison, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, and huge congratulations on the publication of your latest novel.
Thank you, Heather, and hello everyone. I can't see you, but I know you're there, and I just had a message from Rosella, so that was lovely as well. And I'm so glad so many friends, old and new, were able to attend. And thank you, Heather and RedDoor, for getting this book out into the world. I'm really excited at its launch today. And that's really all I wanted to say at this point. So back to you, Heather.
Thank you, Alison. We're really thrilled to be here today. So now I'm going to do a reading from the book to set the scene. So this is from chapter 1 of the novel. Part 1, Sydney, March 1989. Aunt Tabula was banging about downstairs, rattling crockery and crashing saucepan lids like cymbals, an early morning concerto that only Annika could hear. Reluctantly, she threw off the bed covers, stumbled to the bathroom, and confronted her green-tinged reflection in the pitiless mirror. After splashing her freckled face with water and finger-combing her sleep-mussed hair, she was ready to greet the day. "Good morning, Aunt Tabula." In the kitchen, Annika had to shout over the rat-a-tat-tat of cutlery landing in the drawer. The open back door framed the view of a narrow brick path leading to the disused outhouse. Beyond the paling fence at the end of the yard, terraced houses stepped down the hill like rows of dominoes, waiting to be knocked down. In the distance were the curves of the Glebe Island wheat silos and, above it all, the already bright cobalt sky of another hot March day. "I can hear you," Tabula said. "No need to bellow." Her face might have been ordinary if it wasn't for her smile that made dimples appear by her mouth and crow's feet radiate out from the corner of each eye. This gave her the lively look of someone who laughed a lot, although she didn't. Yet somehow the rarity of her smiles and the asymmetry of her dimples made her expression irresistible, and Arnica found herself smiling whenever she did. And Tabula was smiling now as she jabbed with her forefinger at the Sydney Morning Herald that was spread across the kitchen table. It was open at the arts pages, and an advertisement ringed with a black felt tip pen. Before giving Arnica a chance to read it, she explained that on the first Wednesday of every month, the Art Gallery of New South Wales invited people to bring in their artworks to learn if they were genuine or forgeries. "That's next week," Tabula said. The date, Wednesday, 7th of March, 1989, had been twice underlined. "Now you can find out if the picture you have is something worth taking care of." "Of course it's worth taking care of, but it's really your painting." "It's yours, Arnica," Tabula said. "I gave it to you, remember?" When Arnica's father had said she was to take the portrait with her the day she left Hungary, he'd explained that it belonged to Tabula, or more precisely to Tabula's husband, who died years before. After Arnica arrived in Sydney, Tabula had refused to accept it. She said it brought back too many sad memories. Besides, Arnica had quickly learned that Tabula was fond of her besides. She'd been without it since 1956, so she could manage without it now, and anyway, she'd never liked it much. Mawkish pictures of women with badly fitted dresses falling off their shoulders weren't her thing. She was a dressmaker after all, but she was happy that Arnica loved it. Her aunt was ever magnanimous, Arnica knew, but if the portrait of the auburn-haired woman turned out to be worth something, maybe she would talk to Tabula about selling it. Even with Arnica's study allowance and cheap board at Tabula's house, she found it a struggle to make ends meet. It had been a struggle ever since she'd given up hairdressing and become a part-time university student with a part-time drafting job that could go belly up at any time. Interest rates were that high. Yet there was so much emotional baggage attached, limpet-like, to that portrait of the auburn-haired woman. Arnica loved having her on the wall at the foot of her bed. She loved waking up to see her reflecting the morning light and her own radiance. That glow that the artist had captured with so many small brush strokes laden with colour. The woman in the portrait reminded Arnica of home, that particular afternoon when she'd left Budapest. That afternoon when her father, watched closely by her grandmother, Nienye, had thrust the painting into her hands and later into the bottom of her suitcase where it had fitted perfectly. Now it was her legacy from Tabula, and she couldn't ever think of getting rid of it, could she? Still, she would love to learn who the artist was. The signature at the bottom of the picture was nothing more than an illegible scribble. Tabula ripped out the advertisement from the paper and handed it to Arnica. "I'd love to know more about it too," she said. "I'm happy to go," Arnica said, and she was, although she knew from Tabula's expression that she had no choice in the matter. So that should hopefully set the scene for everyone. I'd love to introduce now to you all to the wonderful Ann McGrath, who will be hosting today's Q&A. Ann McGrath is the W.K. Hancock Distinguished Professor of History at the Australian National University and the author of a number of highly regarded histories. Ann also has produced and directed the films Frontier Conversation and Message from Mungo. So now, without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Ann.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Oh, well, it's a great privilege. I'd like to congratulate Alison for her wonderful novel, The Painting. And it's really perceptive and convincing in my view. And I'm honoured to be here on Ngunnawal country in Canberra, Australia, connecting up with our Northern Hemisphere friends, colleagues and book readers. And I know many of you would know Alison, and many of you just probably love good novels. And I'd also like to congratulate the highly professional publishing outfit, RedDoor Press, because I think, congratulations, you've done a beautiful job of producing this fine book. And it also has such an evocative cover design. I'm really wrapped in the cover because I do know what happens. And I think that this doesn't give anything away, but it also has a lot of clues there. So I'll share a few of my own reflections as a reader of this novel, and then I'll ask Alison various probing questions so that attendees will get a chance to understand some of the hidden backstory. But this novel, The Painting, is to my, in my reading, an enthralling and intelligently plotted novel. It ranges over many themes, yet all with the lightness of touch, a crispness and airiness of expression. The characters seem so real, so unaffected, that I almost felt like they were sitting alongside me on the lounge, or perhaps at the table at Roselle, watching Aunt Tobilla sip tea from her Clarice Cliff mug. I enjoyed getting to know each character better, hearing them talk, then following them to the beautifully described places to which they ventured. A beach and Annika's first time dunking in the ocean, to Taronga Zoo, and of course to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which is alongside the Botanical Gardens on Sydney Harbour. So one will almost feel like one's having a bit of a Southern Hemisphere trip, to which, you know, most of you Northern Hemisphere people are totally banned from having, but certainly there is that wonderful experience. The main character, Annika, has a fresh outlook on life. She's young, adventurous, with her life ahead of her. She's appealing and memorable as a character. She's open and skeptical, naive and wise, though she carries the traumas of her past with her and perhaps a troubling family past. The novel personifies the migration experience, exploring personal, family and national histories. As a historian, I liked the tension between her belief that one should leave the past behind to the reality that, to quote, the past was not always willing to let you go. It could, quote, bounce back and knock you hard. The novel is most aptly titled The Painting, as one impressionist painting plays a role throughout. None of the events, nor many of the relationships would have taken place without its role in bringing people together, sometimes in a sinister way. There's always a bit of a sinister element in Alison's novels, even though you feel quite safe that sometimes you think, well, nothing terribly dreadful is going to happen because the novelist seems to be very kindly taking us through the novel as well. The Painting is a satisfying and enjoyable read. Its psychological nuances, its unexpected twists and turns will hold you captive. The happenstances, the serendipity behind the plot lines find echoes, I find, in our own life stories. So now, having said a few words by way of this special launch, which I'm very excited about, I'm now going to go to the probing questions. So, Alison, get ready.
I'm ready.
What actually inspired you to write this novel, The Painting?
A number of things inspired me to write this, but I think the triggering event, or the what if moment, was when I read back in 2014 an article in The Guardian, and it was about a family in Budapest who had discovered, after the death of their parents, a secret collection of paintings. They were all by Hungarian artists. And that raised a lot of questions in my mind, not just about that particular family, but about what would happen if I took that idea and began a story about a painting from a collection like that, which a young woman could carry off with her when she's essentially being a refugee and heading off to Australia. So that was the sort of what if moment. But there were other things that were simmering away in the back of my mind as well. And one was the fact that I grew up in Sydney, a city which I still love. And I don't think you can grow up in Sydney, I don't think you can grow up in Sydney without being aware of the role of migration in that city. There have been so many different waves of migration. And when I went to university, I met, and beforehand, in fact, I met the children of a number of parents who had come from displaced persons camps in Europe after the Second World War. And that, I mean, they made amazing journeys, and I found that very, very interesting. So that was another influence. And the third one was this most amazing and disturbing and iconic photograph that I'd seen when I was very young in my father's study, which was a picture of a Russian tank rolling into Budapest. And I learned subsequently that that was the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. And those three events really came together in this novel. So I used to think that, actually maybe I'll stop there because I know you'll have some more questions to ask.
Well, I'm just very curious about why that photograph of the tanks had such an impact on you as a young child, because I mean, often young children aren't interested in the news or things that happen far away. You know, they couldn't even relate to something like that. So I was wondering why it affected you.
I think it's such a frightening image. It's like the iconic image from the Vietnam War. You know, that child who had been burnt with napalm or whatever it was. That was an image that haunts people. It's still, you know, I think about it and I feel horror. And so for me, that particular image in my father's study really frightened me. And who can say why a person, particularly a child, why a child is frightened by one image or another? And some kids are frightened by different images. So we can't possibly say why that's the case.
So interesting though, because you know, one of the tricks of a good novel, I guess, is to be able to depict the visual. And it's interesting that one of your starting points was the visual. And then of course we've got this painting that everybody is focused on in different ways too. So one thing that I thought was interesting that came out in the novel, and I also noticed it in one of your other novels, was the strong visual element. Because the settings really are lovely with sharp contrasts, and then I noticed your use of the cobalt blue. You know, I think very early on there's cobalt blue sky in Sydney, and I could feel that, you know, this was a beautiful allusion to Sydney. But then you see there's cobalt blue in the dress, in the painting, and there's cobalt blue on Tabilla's dresses, one of the dresses she wears, and then cobalt blue sky through the glazing in Hungary, because in Budapest everything seems more dim and dingy, but you can still get this glint through the sky of something more joyful. Well, so I did wonder whether I was reading too much into this symbolism or whether that was intentional.
I think after you and I had a chat the other day and you said to me, cobalt blue appears rather a lot in the novel, and I went away and I looked at the novel, and in fact I went back to the old Word version and I counted the number of times cobalt blue appears, and it appears 5 times. So it's not as many times as one might think, but I tell you what, blue appears an awful lot in the novel, 37 times. So, but there's a reason why I love cobalt blue. And that's because if you put all the other blues next to cobalt blue, it sings. Cobalt blue just sings, and all the other blues look pale and insignificant. So I just love it. And going back also to your comment about visual aspects, I should come clean and tell people that my first degree was actually in architecture, and that reflects my interests. And, you know, I went into architecture because I was a visual sort of person, and I came out of architecture a more visual sort of person. So that's the background. Does that answer your question about the cobalt blue?
I'm happy with that. Yes, well, I suppose I often think only Australia has this blue, but of course it's not true. It does appear in many paintings and in many skies at certain times of the year. So another thing that I thought was very interesting is that Tom Flood, for example, one of the early commentators on the book, The Advanced Readers, he describes your book, this particular book, as deceptively simple. And so I agree with him on that, but I sort of wonder, is that your aim? And if so, why?
I wouldn't say it's my aim. I think it's just that I do like things to be clear. And whether it's teaching or writing, I like clarity. I don't like being held back by the language. I don't like reading things that are awkwardly written or where the sentences are too long. So it's just the way I like to write. I like things to be clear. And so Tom Flood said deceptively simple, which I thought was rather sweet. Yes, it was nice that he said that. And he also said something about the book being deeply human. And I also liked that comment too. Well, I did puzzle a bit about whether he also meant humane, because to my mind, it's both human as well as humane.
Well, to me, that evokes a kind of truth. You know, deeply human to me evokes this idea that you've achieved a truth effect of how people think and feel. But yeah, I think it's a great compliment, because, you know, you do want the characters to be real and to ring true. And another great strength of all your novels really is the plot. You know, they tend to be unexpected, far more complex than they start out. Because, you know, sometimes there's this just fascinating sort of frisson of who's going to meet who or who's going to become friends with who and so on. But then before you realise, you're part of this unravelling story that doesn't always go where you might expect. So I was just sort of wondering how you actually plan your plots. Do you do it all in
advance? I'm glad it doesn't go where people might expect. I do like that. How do I plan the novels? Well, this particular novel was one of the hardest of all the ones that I've written. But I think I've said that after every novel, actually. This one was hard in the sense that unusually for me, I didn't know how I was going to get to the end. I knew the end that I wanted. I had the final two scenes already in my head, but I didn't know quite how I was going to get there. So I wrote it and rewrote it. I think I did 25 drafts or something. And I didn't do the final draft until the first lockdown last year, when I wrapped it up and then sent it off to RedDoor. But what I normally do is pick which characters, and in this particular novel, there's only one character whose main perspective we're looking from her viewpoint. And in previous novels, I've done multiple viewpoints. But in this novel, it's just one particular viewpoint. And she evolves over the course of the novel. And I wasn't quite sure how she was going to evolve. So that was quite a challenge. Anyway, I'm quite happy with the way it worked out in the end. And the twists and turns were really, they're really to keep the reader guessing and to build narrative tension, because you want the reader to keep turning over the pages. And if you give away everything to begin with, they're not going to want to discover what happens.
Well, you've just sort of brought a couple of things together there, because I was thinking to myself that the character development is like another plot line running simultaneously with the events of the plot line, and you've actually just dobbed yourself in there by talking about how they evolve when I asked you a question about plots. So I think it's really interesting that both of them, both the plot and the characters, are building simultaneously. Which
I would
gets
like
me on to, oh, sorry.
Oh, I'd just like to add to that, if I could, and that is that the painting I view as, it's really like a plot device, in that it's a means of linking 3 generations in the family. And I'm not going to say too much about that, but it's a way of linking across the generations, because the painting connects the generations. And it also connects the countries as well. So I viewed that as a bit of a device. And it was partly why I was so excited when I saw that article in The Guardian about the hidden collection of paintings, because I thought right away that not only is that a what if moment, but it's also a piece of information that allows me to connect up a story through the device of a painting.
Yes, so some people might say the painting is like a key character in the novel, because it really sort of is sparking a lot of the action and mediating a lot of the relationships. But and I know you may not want me to out you on this, but I know that you are a professor of economics, and I think this has already become clear. But I thought it was interesting that you're far more interested in the psychological and emotional affective relationships that people had with the painting than it becomes this transactional thing. Rather, its monetary value doesn't seem to be so important. And I just wondered whether there is a sort of economist slant on that point, or whether you want to put me right about what economists do here.
Well, I think in terms of assigning a value to the painting, I mean, it's invaluable to Arnica, and economists can easily encompass that within their thinking by saying, okay, she puts an infinite value on the painting. So if you think of it, if you want to put it in monetary value terms, okay, the painting might be worth $1,000, but she puts an infinite value on it. So it's worth sort of infinite dollars to her. And so that's just a way of encompassing the notion of value. But also, I mean, I think that probably most people in this audience are economists or architects. But for the, I don't really want to get into a lecture about economics and how it's not just monetary aggregates, but it also encompasses psychological insights and other things. So I think we might leave that for another day.
Yeah, so one of the questions I think that anybody who doesn't write novels wants to ask a novelist is what drives you to write fiction?
well, it's certainly the case that I'm driven to write it and I get obsessed by it. And I think that's because I find it brings peace, so that when I'm writing, I get right out of myself and I get into a world where there's nothing of me there. It's just other characters, and it's characters who they're not always well behaved, but it's a different world, and I find it very refreshing to do that. And so when I come back from that world, if it's been going well, I feel very relaxed. If it hasn't been going very well, that's rather a pain in the neck, but on the times it is going well, it's very satisfying.
Well, yeah, well, I think that's a reader will take away a sense of being very relaxed and satisfied as well. So it's very interesting that you, as the creator of this, have a similar feeling to the feeling I think you share with the readers. They get that very, I mean, I think it's, yeah, one feels satisfied throughout, but also at the end, you know, that's right. You feel you've had a very good read. So, yeah, I've nearly through most of my questions. I probably won't ask them all because we want to leave time for the all the people attending to ask questions too. But one thing I would like to comment on is that this biographical complexity that happens throughout the novel enables the characters to, you know, the reader gets more insight into the characters, gets to know them better, and it's sort of always building and getting richer. And it was striking me that, you know, that's what's happening in some of the really fantastic streaming series that we're able to watch on TV these days, because they have really good writers. And so I sort of wondered what you would think of this being turned into a wonderful TV series.
I would be delighted. Needless to say, I would really love that. I think it would make a good TV series. And I think also, I mean, as you say, it's strongly visual. There's a light and the dark. And I think that could work really well too.
Well, I think that's fantastic, and thank you for asking many varied questions. And I think perhaps now it's time to turn it over to the participants.
Oh, by the way, I just like, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say that I've got a pitch for a TV series. And that is that, because you did mention this the other day, so I think you could think of it as Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch meets Dominic Smith's The Last Painting of Sarah DeVos, with a dash of George Clooney's The Monuments Men thrown in for good measure.
So that would mean you would like to cast George Clooney in at least one of the roles here?
No, definitely not. Definitely not. No, he directed The Monuments Men.
Yeah. Okay, then I think Heather's in charge of the next part of this.
Yeah, I'm really sad now, Alison, that you don't want George Clooney to be involved. I was really excited then. So my own question, linking on from there. So do you have anyone in mind that could play Arnica? Who's your Arnica? Any actresses that fit the bill?
Well, Kate Blanchett, but I think she's not the right age group, but she would be wonderful in the role.
Okay, interesting.
I
think it's always really good to think so visually of these things, because often when I get this experience that when I see something on screen, it's often not the same as what I've imagined in my head. And I suppose that's because your imagination just takes you to the end of the world and back. Whereas when people take the plunge and put something on TV, they actually have to pinpoint people down and make it real. And it probably will never live up to what we all separately imagine in our heads. But I would happily have George involved. So
which role would you give to George?
Oh, anyone. anyone. We have some questions on the chat. So I'm going to start with Kerry from Australia. Says, landscape is obviously important to you, Alison. How did you approach the challenge of a foreign landscape on all levels as opposed to the familiar Australian one?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. I guess the answer to that is twofold. First of all, I read a lot of the history of Budapest. I had to do a lot of reading of the history. And after having my what if moment with the Guardian's article, I then went off and read a lot of history it was actually over several years. And so I got a picture of what Hungary and Budapest were like. And I read from the Second World War onwards. And so I wrote the initial drafts without having seen Hungary or Budapest. And then we went in, I think it was 2017, we went to Budapest and spent the best part of a week hiking around. We took our hiking boots and we hiked all around Buda and Pest and all that area. And that was really important because without that, obviously I would have given a completely wrong flavor for the city because it was just so different from what I imagined. Of course, part of what I imagined was from reading The Siege of Budapest, which was set in 1944-5. So that was obviously erroneous. And then the other image was all those apartments outside Budapest, but the actual city, the city that you could walk around, I could only have written that from visiting.
How much time do you spend researching a novel, would you say? Is it hours, is it days, is it weeks? Is it, how important is that as part of the process of writing a novel?
Well, it's extremely important, but it varies hugely across novels. I would say that this novel and The Philosopher's Daughters were, and my third book, which was a little bit about the Vietnam War, those were the most intensive in terms of doing research. I think this one was more difficult for me because Hungary is not my country. And so it was all new, whereas Australia is my country. And with the first book of mine that you published, A Perfect Marriage, Britain is my country as well. So there's, and anyway, that was contemporary. But I think this has been the most demanding.
Yeah, you were on home turf with those, weren't you? I think it's fair to say. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've referenced it just then, but I know you love walking. And does spending time outside, sort of hiking, combing the pavements, does that help you with the creative process? Do you come up with ideas when you're outside? Does that, is that important to you?
Yes, absolutely. It's a way of thinking. So it's very important. So we're fortunate that we have some bushland quite close to us. So walking through that is really important to me in terms of working out problems in a narrative and a structure, and just in terms of keeping calm as well.
Yeah. So Toan says there is perhaps a cultural difference between Hungarian and Australian. Was that a challenge when you wrote this book, Alison? And how did you solve this issue? It's a good question.
Toan, okay. So I've been lucky enough to know over my life quite a few Hungarians. And so I didn't feel that the cultural difference was all that great. It would be great if I were writing about Vietnam, for example, as a European origin Australian person. But for Hungary, I didn't feel that. I felt that I knew people who were Hungarian, and I knew a lot about what they like, and also about their histories and their pain. Obviously, you never know all that, but you get a bit of an understanding of it.
Excellent. We have another question from Claire at RedDoor. Alison's novels often move back and forth in time. Do you find this easier than a linear narrative?
No, is the answer. No, the one that really went back and forth in time was A Perfect Marriage. That structure was very difficult to write.
So how do you write that? How do you go about that? Do you have things on the wall and you do, you know, clouds and you know, brain dumps and all that kind of stuff? Like how do you go about doing a complex narrative like that?
Well, that one, I wrote it all in linear form initially, and then in chapters, and then I printed out the chapters and I put them on the carpet, on the floor, and crawled around organizing them. And so that was how I worked at it. No doubt somebody who uses Scrivener, which is a software package that allows you to do that on screen, would have a better way of doing it, but that way worked for me on the whole.
Again, very visual, sort of linking back to your architectural days, maybe.
That's true. It's very visual, yes. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Alison made all the subsidiary characters suspicious. Was this difficult to do, not to give too many clues? I always think that. How do you go through, how do you plant clues without giving the game away too much? I think there's a really fine line between, dropping a hint and not giving the game away too soon in the novel. It's quite a difficult balance to strike.
It is. It's very difficult to strike that. And normally I find I don't give away enough to begin with. And then I have to drop clues in order to get to the right point. But yes, that is a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah. And also it can be quite disappointing in a novel if you pick up on something too soon and then it feels like you've spoilt it for yourself when you're reading it and you suss it too soon. I think it's quite a fine art of just drip feeding certain hints and then leading to the big build up at the end, which actually leads me on to my own question. Would you ever write in a different genre, from what you're used to?
Like science fiction?
Yeah, something wildly different. I know science fiction is very different, but would you ever think about it? Would you ever entertain the idea?
Well, sometimes I've thought of writing a dystopian novel, but I think everybody will be writing dystopian novels now with the pandemic.
After COVID? Yeah,
and global warming as well.
So I know that you mentioned in a previous conversation about writing in the pandemic. How was that for you? Did you have a routine? Did it give you structure to days? How was your experience of writing the novel in the pandemic? I only ask because many authors said that they found it a really exhilarating time where they were stuck to their laptops and they created loads of content. And then there were other authors that said that they were just blank and they felt creatively stunted. So how did you feel during the pandemic with your writing process?
I felt like it was an escape. So it was another world that I could get into, that I could control. So it was I suppose you could view it actually as a way of controlling what was going on.
Catharsis or some sort.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. So a question from Helen. You write about the actual painting at the centre of the story with such emotional intelligence into how the characters feel about it. What part has art played in your own family's life, and what does it mean to you?
Art has been very important in my family's life. We were very close to my grandparents. In fact, we lived with them for the first 6 or 7 years of my life. And they had a lot of paintings in their house. And there was an artist who dropped around regularly as well. And then my mother liked landscapes and my father liked sort of oriental type paintings. And then I think I got the love of art from them actually, and then from my own development when I was at school, when I studied art for a while before dropping it for chemistry. And then at university we did history of art, which was a wonderful course, and history of architecture as well, all the way through. So that's family background. I don't know if that answers Helen's question or not.
Well, it certainly shows. I think history of art to chemistry is quite a broad spectrum of subject matter. I feel that you encompass quite a substantial spectrum of subject matter in your research, your background, your university career, sort of, the whole process. Who would you say is your favourite character in the book? Is it Annika or is it someone else?
I think I'd have to say Annika.
Yeah.
But I'm very fond of her aunt as well.
Yeah, I am. I feel like my favourite is Aunt Tabilla. I do like her dry approach.
Yes.
And is it important to you that Annika is so strong-minded? Did you deliberately do that with the book? Did you have that in mind, or did that sort of develop? Was it important, or is it central to you or her?
I think when you say strong-minded, do you mean determined or strong in general?
Yeah, I think she's determined, isn't she? I think I've got the sense she's determined.
Well, to be honest, she just turned up like that. I know this sounds a bit of a cop-out, but very often my characters, they just turn up on the paper and with a mind of their own, and off they go. And
they develop as you're writing, and you let them develop a character of their own rather than being quite strict with how you think they're going to be.
Yes.
Yeah. Anne mentioned, which I totally agree with, that you often have a sinister element in your books. Is that deliberate? Are you going to ever write a really sinister novel? Is that, a hint of what could be down the line, or do you just like sort of elements of it? It's sort of the hint rather than making it very sinister.
Well, I didn't actually know that I did that. So
well, I agree. I agree with Anne. I think there are sinister overtones. That's what I call it. Sinister overtones and elements.
Well, I could bump them up and write it. Something really nice.
I'd love, if you did, I'd love that. Would be amazing. So what do you read to relax? What's your go-to book to wind down with?
Well, I read fairly eclectically, but at the moment I'm listening to Charles Dickens on audiobooks. And then what have I read? I've just finished reading a novel by a colleague at the ANU. And so I read very eclectically, and I read contemporary fiction, historical fiction. I don't read any science fiction, and I don't read any fantasy. Mm-hmm. But maybe I should read some more crime, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. What's your favourite book? What would you say is your favourite book of all time? Or do you have one? Or is it too hard?
No, I do have one. It's Riders in the Chariot. Riders in the Chariot by Patrick White. That's definitely my all-time favourite book.
And why? Why is that your favourite?
Because of the characterization, because of the fact that it is transcendental. The characters are 4 different characters from very different walks of life, and they all have something in common. And I really love the way that he combined those diverse characters with extraordinary psychological insights and sympathy for their histories. It's just a brilliant novel.
It sounds quite a challenging, is it quite a challenging novel? You know, one that you really have to engage with rather than, you know,
you do have to engage with it.
Yes. Yeah, it sounds like you get a lot from it.
You read it slowly, but you can read it many times.
Mm-hmm. So question from Kerry, to what extent did the issues of truth and integrity take their own direction in the book?
Truth and integrity. Ooh, I don't want to give the plot away. So I think I might not answer that question. Sorry, Kerry.
It's hard, isn't it? Because
yes.
it is quite entangled, and we don't want to give the plot. We don't want to spoil it because the ending is so good. Maggie has asked, who is your favourite novelist? I don't know if it's the same author as the one you just mentioned, or do you have a favourite novelist that has written many books that you have read?
I think Patrick White is still my favourite novelist.
Yeah. My personal question is, are you writing anything at the moment?
Yes, I am. But I am writing something at the moment, yes. And I've done a first draft, and that's draft. I need to do another 25.
Well, that's leads it itself onto, clearly you do a lot of drafting. Is that a really important part of the process for you? Clearly, do you get the first draft down and then you work from there, and then you redraft and redraft and redraft? And yes. Also, how do you know when you're finished?
I think I certainly do draft and redraft, and I find very difficult getting the initial story down just because it's so daunting. The thought that you've got an idea and you're going to write for 80,000, 90,000 words. That's a very, very daunting thing. But once you've got through that and got something down, then the fun part for me begins, because you can start shifting it around and you see what's wrong and you give it to some trusted friends and readers and they make suggestions, and then you put it to one side and come back to it.
Yeah. So do you, one of my questions was, do you have readers, sort of beta readers? Who do you go to for, who are your trusted readers, feedback wise? Do you let it out of your hands and let people see it? Are you quite guarded? How is that process for you?
I choose my readers very carefully, because I have to trust them, obviously. Yeah.
Oh, they obviously know who they are.
Yes.
Yeah. And do you have any, well, you've said that you wouldn't do dystopian fiction or fantasy, but is there any subject matter that you wouldn't go near, or is everything up for grabs? You know, when you said you were inspired by this Guardian article, are you quite willing to sort of take examples from the world, or is there anywhere where anything that you wouldn't want to write about?
Well, I think going back to Tone's question earlier about the cultural differences, I think I wouldn't want to write about from the perspective of a Vietnamese person or someone whose culture is very distinct from my own.
Yeah.
Just as I wouldn't want to write from the perspective of an Indigenous Australian's, because, well, in their case, that would be for a different reason, but I just wouldn't want to write from the viewpoint of someone whose culture is so far from my own that I could make terrible blunders and mistakes.
Yeah. And I'm going to take one last question as we are nearly out of time. Julia has asked, how does your own faith, ethical morals, beliefs inform yourself writing? Is it, or does it not? Do you try and be?
I think my code of ethics informs who I am, and that probably informs my writing. But I mean, it probably informs the choices that I make. So beyond that, I can't really say.
Yeah. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel like I've learnt so much. I'm really grateful to you both for your time. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Alison, for sharing your wonderful novel with us. And thank you all for sharing your time with us today. We're really grateful that you could spend time with us. Just to say, the painting is now available from all good online retailers. Congratulations, Alison, on your publication day.
Thank you.
And take care, everyone. Stay safe and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.